Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. In this week's episode, we take a look at the outlook for energy demand amid droughts, heat waves, record low river and hydro levels, dwindling gas supply, and issues with France's nuclear fleet. Some industrial units at fertiliser factories and aluminium smelters have already announced closures. To what extent have we witnessed demand destruction? And what industries are at further threat of closure or mothballing due to extremely high energy prices? We have three experts for you this week, but divided the pod into two parts. I hope you enjoy the discussion that was recorded on the sidelines of Montel's Nordic Energy Day. Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, to talk about the demand outlook in Germany is our old friend Tobias Federico. Tobias, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Perfect. I'd like to start by talking about current market dynamics. What is the situation ahead of the winter, and what are your main concerns?
The market is very dynamic. I think we skipped the fundamental pricing and come to psychological pricing in the gas market and as well as in the power market. So prices are skyrocketing, and due to the market design, we might see extreme prices. So these high prices are not coming to the households right now within Germany. It will be seen next year or over next year. But we see this in the industrial sector that they directly see the wholesale market prices in their electricity and gas bills.
And this is what I wanted to talk to you about today in particular, and the outlook for industry. Have we seen so far in 2022 a reduction in demand? Is it too soon to be talking about demand destruction so far this year?
Yeah, it is. I think right now, so far, it's too soon to talk about it. We see demand reduction, mostly due to fuel switch. And the reason is that most of the industrial sectors still have the old supply contracts. 25% of them are short for next quarter. So they then will reduce or maybe destruct their electricity and gas demand. But right now, currently in the situation, we have a demand reduction, which is mostly due to fuel switch.
And in which sectors in particular?
Well, of course, it's energy-intensive industries, but they already did some good hedging in total. What we see is that in the medium-sized industry sector, especially glass production, textile sector, they might be facing the issues, the price issues.
I mean, we've seen a spate of fertiliser factories, even some big aluminium producers shutting down production in Europe. Do you expect this to happen in Germany?
Well, if you have big industries who can swap to other nations or to other continents, then yes, medium-sized companies, they don't do it right now. What we see in Germany is that they are thinking about shutting down due to the high prices. They're not doing it actually right now, but fertilizer sector has some additional problems due to the war and Ukraine and Russia. And it's not only driven by the electricity prices, but also.
Yeah. I mean, these industries, especially the small to medium-sized companies, they're the powerhouse of Germany and Germany's economy. I mean, what would this do to Germany in general and the economic outlook?
Well, it's the backbone of the German economy, that's true. And it has two elements. Either they are really shutting down and reducing their workforce, which then will lead to a high unemployment rate and a lower buying purchase power. Or they have the capacities to transfer the production prices, the new production prices with the high electricity and gas costs down to the end consumer, which then will lead to a much higher inflation rate. So both are not really good news.
It's hard to see any good news in the current outlook, but I think Germany has set a target. It wants to reduce demand by 15%. That's for both electricity and gas, right?
No, right. It's mostly for gas.
Yeah.
It's not for electricity. I think the industrial sector does well, mostly due to fuel switching and the issue we talked about before. The household sector and the small and medium-sized, the small businesses, the bakeries, for example, they are also part of the household sector. It's called household and small medium businesses. They are not reducing at all right now, mostly due to the fact that it's heating gas. So we must come into the heating period to see any effect there.
But if you see this kind of demand reduction, does that on the industrial sector or even in the household sector up to 15%, would that then mitigate the effect of these very high prices? Could you then see the prices coming down?
No, I think we have lost the fundamental pricing right now. It's all psychological pricing. What it leads to is that it reduces the risk of the real gas shortage. So in German, it's called a Gasmangellage, which is expecting to start in the worst case scenario end of December, in the best case scenario end of January. And if we are able to reduce the gas demand by the 15%, it will reduce the likelihood of this gas shortage.
And in terms of storage, where are we now, and what's the plan going forward here in gas storage, Tobias?
Well, actually, we are in a very good way. We are currently at 80% gas storage level. We wanted to achieve 75% by the end of August, 85% by the end of September. So here we are in a very good way. Under the current production out of Nord Stream 1 at 20%. There will be this extraordinary maintenance at the end of August. And it's very likely that it will not come up to 20% after that. And but still, I think we are going to manage the gas storage levels target we wanted to achieve, which is good.
I mean, what's your view here? I mean, you mentioned Nord Stream 1. I'd just like to ask you about the likelihood of it coming back at all. And, this is clearly part of Putin's strategy to weaponize gas, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely. Gas is a weapon, and it's used against us to hit our economy. If Nord Stream 1 would not come back at all, we might face technical problems with the gas wells because there will be so much pressure that it will hit the gas wells itself. There are two possibilities. Either at the gas wells, gas will be burned to reduce the pressure within the gas field, or it will be delivered at very low percentage. And I think it's quite likely that it will be the last one. So 5-10% might come up in the mid of September again, but not reaching 20, 40 or 100% levels right now until we might not face the gas shortage. So in the case Putin will see that we are managing to deal with the winter, then he wants to hit us in the other way. I think it's quite likely that after that he's going to flood us with gas. So as with a technical miracle, Nord Stream 1 will produce at 100% in February. And then we have very low gas prices. And then we have the other curve, very low prices. And you have a lot of financial problems in this case.
So that's going to, that leads me on to the next question, Tobias, which is the outlook for next year. I mean, how likely is that Nord Stream 1 will be producing 100%? I mean, that's... from where we're standing now, it seems a very remote possibility.
Well, right now, yes, because we are facing a tight winter, and this is what Putin really wants. I think from a technical design, it's a bit weird that one gas turbine missing causes all these effects because it's a super important technical component and it has redundancies, technicals on the technical side. So when or if Putin uses gas as a weapon, there are different strategies. And that's why in total, I think it's quite unlikely, but in certain scenarios, it could be a much higher likelihood. The question is, do we need still that much gas from Russia, and do we want to pay him for that? He now is declaring force majeure for the reduction, so he's still a good gas supplier of his point of view. Because it's a technical issue and nothing he can deal with, but in the end, it's part of this whole campaign.
Yeah, it's this sort of turbine blame game. It's quite astonishing, really. It's just one excuse after another. The final question, Tobias. We're in extraordinary times, extremely high prices, a scarcity of gas, mainly, as you say, rightly due to Putin. And the activities of Russia here. So the situation is you could say is a result of the war. Households and companies are paying extremely high prices. Is there a case for providing financial support, especially for companies, ahead of any kind of rationing? I mean, what's the likelihood of long-winded question. Should governments provide financial support to ailing companies or suppliers, energy companies, or should we, and to households?
Maybe one addition to that, the war was the initiator somehow for the problems, but on top of that came other problems, which is the drought and which is also the French nuclear power plants. So it's a combination of lot, which is almost a perfect storm. But coming to the question with the financial support, yeah, of course, financial support could be helpful in the short term, but just paying the price differences might not be a good investment in the long term. There should be financial support connected to energy efficiency, energy reduction, for example, that you take the money and invest it into lower energy consumption, especially in the household sector. And we missed that for years. And in Germany, especially, we have the effect of landlord and renter. So who's benefiting from energy efficiency is the person who's renting, but who needs to invest that is the landlord. So there is a gap, and we must fill that gap. Yes, financial support is needed, but it's just a short-term effect. In addition to that, we need an additional package, which is really solving problems which have been there since 20, 30 years.
So, I mean, I wouldn't want to be a politician in this market situation, but what would be your recommendation for politicians in Berlin, Tobias?
Actually, honestly, I must say that the decisions they've made until now, also the reaction time was quite good. Now with this additional gas fee to support the real procurement cost of gas suppliers, has this missing part that obviously also trading companies who are not facing bankruptcy apply for that. So there might be a change in the law. But looking into what they should do is really look into the household. How can we increase energy efficiency in the household? In addition to the financial support. But being a politician right now, I totally agree, it's not so easy.
No. Tobias, thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast.
It's always a pleasure, Richard.
In the second part of the podcast on demand destruction, I'm speaking to Mark Turner of Baringa. A warm welcome to you, Mark.
Thank you.
And Alexander Andresen of Elkem. A warm welcome to you as well, Alexander.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. I'd like to start off by asking you, Alexander, about your concerns ahead of the winter, given the current market situation.
Yeah, that's quite a good questions, and there's plenty of things to be concerned about. I think. I mean, the power market now in Norway and in Europe is in a quite it's a bad situation. It's a dire situation, and for most large industries like ourselves in Elkem, we have long-term power contracts, so we're not really that concerned about the power price as such in the short term. For us, the biggest concern is actually security of supply and the risk of being curtailed or being rationed. That's probably the biggest risk as I see it. And then longer term, of course, the price is also a big concern.
Absolutely. And Mark, what are you hearing in the market at the moment? What are people's fears ahead of the winter season?
Yeah, there's almost such a long list at the moment that we could use where to stop on this. I think for unhedged consumers, prices are very concerning at the moment. Also, the disparity between regions, and we're here at the Nordic Energy Day conference, and we heard this morning about the huge disparity between the north of Norway and the south of Norway, and the high prices in the south, close to zero in the north. That's causing tensions in a number of markets. I think security of supply, absolutely agree, is really top of mind. Then there are things like weather impacts, and we might expand on this further, but the situation is bad. But if we have a cold winter in Europe, then that will hugely increase the severity of the situation. And then personally, I think that the risk of energy nationalism is, in my opinion, a big concern. So this fear, I think, that if there is a stress situation, countries will start to act in that nationalistic way and avoid the sharing of resources, close off interconnection, that sort of thing. Again, my view is we're all in this together. We need to have an integrated response. But I would say that's a pretty high concern as well.
What's your view here, Alexander?
I'd also like to add another thing, and that's it's difficult to see the end of the problems. We've had periods of high power prices before in the Nordic and other places in Europe. Then it's usually related to things like short-term outages of nuclear plants. It's a dry weather or cold weather, things like that, where the power system as such has not really changed, and you can kind of see the end of it. You know that the weather is mean reverting, and if it's dry, then at a later stage it's gonna rain more. But the difference now is that it's really difficult to see what's the end of this. How is it gonna end? A lot of at least the price problems hinges on the gas price. So in order to bring the gas price down, then how are you going to do that? Are you going to increase imports from Russia again? It doesn't really seem very likely. Or you have to import additional LNG, which is maybe possible, but also takes time to expand capacity and so on. So it really seems like it's gonna go on for a long time.
What are the solutions, Alexander? Here, do you think the market design needs to be changed or altered? Is the current way of operating the wholesale market, is it fit for purpose for industrial groups such as yourself?
Yeah, I think long term, I think that the problem is solvable, and I think the solution is pretty obvious. It's energy efficiency. It's building more production or power production capacity. But the big problem is that the problem has to be solved on a short term as well. So it has to be solved immediately, and then the solutions are not as obvious. And then it's very easy to resort to market intervention, because it's more or less the only thing that can affect prices short term. And in Elkem, we're also a big fan of free trade, open markets, let the market work. But there is, as we also discussed on the conference today, there's this kind of disparity between an economic optimal outcome and what's politically acceptable. And as we see these days, I mean, the power market works. But it's a hard sell for politicians to tell voters that the power market works while they're freezing.
Absolutely, of course, and the populations demand action or demand some sort of change in order to alleviate their increasingly difficult cost of living. If I can turn to what we've seen so far in 2022, Mark, have we seen a reduction in demand demand for both gas and power in Europe in 2022?
So the picture around demand so far this year is interestingly quite mixed. So we have seen shutdowns which have been widely reported around some energy-intensive industries, particularly around fertilizers, around chemicals, chemical feedstocks. So there's a very high-profile announcement of an ammonia plant permanent closure in the UK. We've had urea production, methanol production shutting down really across Europe. So we've seen examples in the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, Croatia, Romania. All of those have had industrial plants that have curtailed production. So we have seen that, and especially around those producers that are not heavily hedged, as clearly a lot of the big producers in certainly the Nordic region are. I think, though, elsewhere, honestly, I don't think we have seen a lot of evidence yet of demand destruction. And indeed, we've seen demand being higher year on year on the power side in a number of markets across Europe, partly linked with the very high temperatures, very high air conditioning load. So especially Italy and Spain, for example. In fact, I think Italy this morning reported around 2 to 3% higher power demand so far this year versus last year. So I think it is mixed.
And Alexander, is it too soon to talk of destruction rather than demand reduction?
I think we can already speak of demand destruction, because some of these closures of industrial plants that we have seen over the last 12 months are probably going to be permanent. When you curtail or when you shut down a plant, then you don't revive production at that plant before times are better and the outlook is good and favorable. and that will take some time, I believe. And also in certain industries, the cost of restarting a plant can be extremely high, especially in the metal business, and especially aluminium. So once you have a closure, then there's always a risk that that closure will be more permanent than initially thought.
Absolutely. You can't just turn these factories on and off.
Exactly.
And of course, that would have, long-term economic effects for the countries at large, and that's a major
definitely
concern. Yeah. What's your outlook for next year, Mark? What do you expect here? Do you expect more of these? I mean, you mentioned chemicals and fertilizer factories, but also some major aluminium producers have shut down shut down production in continental Europe.
Indeed, and I totally agree. I mean, a lot of this is around industries where there's global competition, and we know that while Henry Hub gas prices, for example, have increased, they remain many times lower than we see in Europe. Asian gas prices are also lower, although they're much higher than in the US. So this is an issue. I think for next year, a lot really depends on what happens with Russian gas flows. So I think if there is a continued very low level of import of Russian gas into Europe, then we will be facing probably not a winter of difficulty, but 2 or 3 winters in our view. And I think the idea that this is about getting through the next winter, in my view, is a misconception. It looks very difficult through next year, and we will need to deplete gas storage levels to a very, very low point, likely over the coming winter. Refilling those over the next summer will not be straightforward. And so we see perhaps the next winter after that, 2023-24, being even more difficult from an energy supply perspective. I think one of the things that could almost quote unquote help here around the demand side is just what's happening in the economy. And we already see leading indicators of recession around the European economy, as well as globally. So, I mean, China, for example, is experiencing a slowdown. That will help. It should help reduce energy demand overall. Not the same as demand destruction, but and is clearly not a positive thing overall. But it will help to some extent on the power demand and gas demand sides.
I mean, a lot of what we're seeing, there are a lot of local developments, local situations such as the drought in Europe, the depleted hydro reservoirs in Norway, and at the same time, gas is very much a global concern, and there's a scarcity globally. So, I mean, I don't know how much it would help to move to a different geographical location, because you'd still experience, like China's experienced severe drought and had to curtail production. America is also seeing increased in prices. So, does it really help to move production, Alexander? Or?
Yeah, it's a good question, because as you're saying, they have power curtailments in China as well. Power prices in North America are on the rise. But still, in all of those areas, the cost of energy is much, much lower than in Europe. Partially because industrial tariffs are usually regulated in most countries outside Europe. And also, when looking at North America, gas prices have increased a lot, but they're still far, far below international LNG prices and also the European gas prices. So it's and on top of that, you have the CO2 cost, of course.
That's an important element here. Is there a fear that there could be a domino effect here, Alexander? You see, some companies shutting down, that this could hit us in 2023, that gradually major industry is forced out of Europe. Is this a realistic concern?
Yeah, it's at least it's a risk. And the main problem now that has not really been discussed before is that you've had some industrial curtailments over the last 12 months. But the big problem has not really come to the surface yet, and that's in industry you usually sell your products on forward contracts, like a quarter ahead, 2 quarters ahead, maybe 1 year ahead. So during last winter, then most industrial companies, at least in the metal business, had already sold their production for the next 6 to 12 months, and most of them are hedged with long-term PPAs. So they sort of had to run. Some did shut down, but most of them had to run. But over time, you will see the high energy prices. The high energy prices will have to be reflected in the sales price of the European companies. And then at these power costs that we've seen over the last half year, most European companies are not really competitive anymore. So I think you had some demand destruction over the last 12 months, but I think the real effect might still be ahead of us because they had, over the last year, they still had contracts they had to honor, and those are being renegotiated now.
What's your view here, Mark? I mean, is the worst yet to come?
It could be, and I think that impact on big industrials, I totally agree, is going to crystallize over the next 12 months, 18 months, and it's very unhelpful, I think, for Europe in terms of the longer term view of security of supply, not just of energy, but the ability to source the base chemicals, the concrete, the cement, the metals that they need, for industrial growth, and that there has been a drive to bring more of that closer to home in Europe. And again, the potential trend here is unhelpful in that regard as well.
So you think there is a danger that a lot of European heavy industry could be forced out?
I think there is that clear risk. These are global markets. The problem is that this is, by and large, a European problem right now. There are impacts on gas markets globally, yes, but nowhere near the sort of impacts that we're seeing in Europe. And therefore, going back to the competitiveness point, the US looks very competitive right now. Asia looks more competitive. There are issues there, but I think there is that risk. Yeah.
And, it's very hard. I mean, I wouldn't like to be a policymaker or a politician in this kind of environment, but what can we expect or what can we demand from politicians at this time? What are the expectations from industry? How can they help?
Yeah, it is indeed a difficult question, and I think looking into the far future, it's quite easy to answer. Like I said previously, I think the answer is we have to have more power available. It's quite obvious. We have to have more production. We have to save as much energy as we can through energy efficiency and so on. Short term, it's more difficult, and you easily tend to revert back to solutions around state intervention with prices, state intervention with who gets what power supply, and that's those are really, really difficult decisions. And there are so many things to consider, like moral hazard. Should you start to help companies that should have entered into long-term contracts but didn't do so? That's difficult. I think with small businesses, the answer is probably easier. But then where you draw the line between a small business and a business which is larger and should have hedged their power consumption. So there's a lot of difficult questions lying ahead. And I just want to comment on another thing on the previous question, and that's the interconnectedness of the industrial value chain, because there's in industry has a long value chain from like mining through metals and then down to final goods, and all of that is a very complex web of specialized products and of contracts and supply chains that have been developed over decades. And when you get this kind of shock and certain producers are more or less forced to curtail their production, then you upset that whole supply chain. Now we have some experience with that from the COVID years, but that just adds to the problem.
And to the complexity, I'm sure. And I know, probably we wouldn't like to be in the shoes of the politicians at the moment, Mark. But what's your view? What options do they have at the moment?
I think it's very difficult, and there will be intense pressure for politicians to do something. And inevitably, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of discussion around the market, around reforming it, around big interventions like, do we get rid of marginal priced commodity and power markets? Do we completely scrap the current market design? I think when you get a situation like we have now, where there are huge disparities between the winners and losers in the markets, and that, to be clear, there are not just losers here. There are some players in the market making huge windfalls around current price levels. So the likes of unhedged renewables, for example, who are in the market earning astronomical prices for their production. Similarly with nuclear assets, even with thermal assets, which are making substantial clean spark spreads at the moment. And therefore, I think some element of redistribution is almost inevitable. The fact is, not everyone can be shielded from the market. So unfortunately, there will be some players that will suffer over this period. But I think my one ask more than anything is that there isn't a knee-jerk reform and a knee-jerk policy response. I think we still need to look beyond this immediate crisis, because I think, to Alexander's point, it feels like it won't end, but it will end at some point. And actually, my personal view is we may well end up with an overreaction. We bring online a lot more gas supply. We actually end up with a lower gas price in 5-10 years' time than we would have had otherwise. We need to keep our eye on the big picture of where the energy mix is going in Europe, of net zero energy systems, and what is the market design that's going to be fit for purpose for that long-term outcome in 2030, 40, 50, and not be too deflected by the current crisis, as severe as it is.
Of course, any such measure or redistribution is very hard to make fair and equitable, and who sets the criteria, who makes the rules is difficult. Would you have faith in politicians, both on a national EU level, to change the market design in a way that reflects the market dynamics, and ever more renewables coming in, and the move towards net zero?
I think, as you just said, I think we have to keep the long-term picture in mind and not do anything or overreact to the current crisis and initiate a new system, which in 2 or 3 years is not fit for purpose at that point in time. So it's important to keep the long-term perspective.
So it's a long-term fix rather than this sort of a plaster approach, just sort of patching over, a patchwork approach of interventions. Yeah.
I think it's only 2 years ago we discussed the risk of energy prices going to zero. So energy would be for free, basically, and what you would pay for is basically the balancing services. And that's 2 years ago, and things change fast. And there's something called recency bias. So you tend to just extrapolate the current situation indefinitely or for a long time. If there's anything we learned from this market, is that something happens that changes the market. Usually it's something unexpected.
A final question. Fascinating discussion, guys. But a final question really is on rationing. Do you expect that maybe it's a last resort? But what's the likelihood of that happening in over the coming winter, Alexander?
I think in Europe as such, I think that's quite likely. When you look at the situation now with gas supplies and also the nuclear situation in France and also in Germany, there is clearly a lack of enough power and gas. So I think with normal weather going through the winter or even colder than normal, then I think it's a high likelihood of some rationing. And then I would also like to add to that rationing of power, it's not really a hard line, because I would also say that very high prices, it's also a sort of rationing. When you have peak prices for the coming winter in France, I think it's now 20 euros per megawatt hour. What is it? 20,000 euros per megawatt hour. It's really high. It's 20 kroner per kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. That's also a form of rationing.
And rationing, who's in charge with rationing? Who decrees who gets what, Mark?
I think a lot of those rules, a lot of the guidelines actually still need to be written. So there are rules which ring fence, for example, domestic consumers, etc. So I think it's a fair assumption that households will be a last resort in terms of rationing. Interestingly, there was a fascinating paper from the IMF a month or so back, where they looked at the impact of Russian gas being turned off entirely, and they looked at the best order of rationing in order to minimize the GDP impact of the rationing. And they came up with a merit order, if you will, of sort of industrials by order of least impact, starting with sort of non-metallic chemicals, non-metallic elements, ceramic, glass, moving through to ferrous metals. I think steel, aluminium was sort of fourth in a list of 3 or 4. So I thought that was quite interesting on the sort of economically optimal way of rationing. I think the other thing they drew out that I think is really key is the impact that household demand could have on avoiding rationing elsewhere, and even quite small changes on the household side, voluntary changes that could be invoked would be very beneficial. And I actually think there's more that governments can do in terms of informing households and end consumers what simple measures they can take and actually what impact that would have. Everyone's talking about, turning down the thermostat by a degree or 2, but there are lots of other examples of small interventions. And I personally think a public information campaign would be useful. I think people want to help, but they don't necessarily know the best way of doing that. And I think elevating that would be good.
Absolutely. The message to the public. I mean, I'm often quite struck by walking around Oslo in the evenings, how many lights are on in offices. I mean, okay, you don't save that much, but across the country and across the continent, I think there are a few gigawatt hours to be saved. Alexander and Mark, thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.